I write software. So, in fact, I spend a lot of my time renaming procedures or renaming global or local variables. There are certain common ones that you use over and over again in routine matters. But you can actually look at my software code and it reads like English. And people who know nothing about software engineering might look at my software code and say, "You mean to tell me you can just write what the computer needs to know and it does it?" My software code looks like that. This is because I'm so careful about my terminology, and a person has to be. We all have to be. People say, "Well, he uses big words," and as if you use big words for the sake of using big words. But the thing is, exacting terminology, which is self-explanatory. Circulatory inflation, price inflation. You see, these things. In part, I would complain instead that those terms are prejudiced toward people understanding them more easily because they're accustomed to this word inflation. So I'm using it as a matter for their comfort, whereas I don't believe that inflation is the proper term, you see. So anyway, all those arguments aside, terminology is important, and without it, I'm sorry, the listeners can't understand either, So the terminology is meant to be, self-explanatory. Anyway, so I give these three categoric faults, and they are inflation and deflation, circulatory inflation and deflation, that is. And I add one thing to them, which I call maldisposition. And the reason I add this thing to this categoric fault is where interest is involved. Interest is inherently multiplying artificial indebtedness in proportion to a circulation. So it's dedicating ever more of the circulation to servicing debt versus leaving ever less to sustain the industry which is obligated to serve the debt. So this is maldisposition. It isn't good enough to just solve the proportional issues that you want to maintain a one-to-one-to-one relationship between circulation, remaining value of represented wealth, and remaining obligation. It isn't good enough just to do that if that circulation is dedicated ever more so to servicing debt versus sustaining industry. Eventually, industry would collapse as a result of maldisposition, which is caused again by interest. So the first categoric fault is inflation, circulatory deflation, and circulatory maldisposition. The second I give is systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property. And for the sake of the listeners, what we can interpret that as is just bad. In other words, you had $5, you want to go to the candy store and buy a bunch of bubble gum, and by the time you get there, instead of buying 500 pieces, you can only buy 5. Which might be better for you, I don't know. But it's bad if you're an investor. It's systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property always causes an injustice upon someone. There's some people that may benefit from it, whereas others are offended. And the third categoric fault is inherent, irreversible, and therefore terminal multiplication of artificial indebtedness by interest. And we need to come back to this thing that I've just said, artificial indebtedness. But so the third categoric fault is understood to be terminal. So in 1968, you did not have quote-unquote economists claiming that this obfuscation of the currency would cause terminal monetary failure. But off the top of my head, what I had just explained that what I had phrased in the way of rhetorical questions to my economics teacher is a proof that any economy based on interest-bearing debt ultimately terminates itself under insoluble debt. So the importance of my work from the time that I was 16 is that it implied a an inevitable terminal monetary failure. And the second thing was that there was one and one only solution for all these categoric faults, all of which impose injustice upon us. So the only just economy, too, then, is this one and one only formula for mathematically perfected economy, which is an eradication of interest and an obligatory schedule of payment, which pays principal out of circulation at the rate of consumption and thus maintains a perpetual one-to-one-to-one relationship between remaining value of represented property, remaining circulation, and remaining obligation. Obligation cements the whole thing together. There is no such thing as an honorable principle if it's not an obligation. And an obligation translates to a debt, and many of my plagiarists are advocating debt-free money and all this. Well, these are just lies. They're only looking at one aspect of what they're actually saying, and I hold them accountable. And I'll say, well, you can't just spend money into circulation. They say, why not? And I said, because it's inflationary. Well, it's not inflationary. They say it doesn't introduce more money than circulation. I said, well, yes, but suppose you didn't produce anything. Well, that's never going to happen. Well, it can happen. We can produce less. The amount of possessions can go in decline. But it's the principle that we need to understand, that we need to account for, which I'm trying to explain to you. So listen, I say it can happen. So suppose the value of property goes into diminishes, as it does naturally. You're not paying that money out of circulation. And therefore, there's an increase in circulation, not from your introduction of the money, but the persistence of it without an obligation to pay it out of circulation. And then they turn around and they create a fact that it can be accounted for. Oh, no, you don't understand, they say. There is such a process. It's taxation. And then I said, then you're agreeing with me exactly. But what justifies that you do that by taxation? If you spent this money into circulation for houses, the person who consumes the house should be paying for it. And that's the very mechanism you need to account for this, even without any regulation, which is part of the beauty of mathematically perfected economy, is it solves inflation and deflation and inherent irreversible multiplication of artificial indebtedness without even any regulation, merely by the obligatory schedule of payments. So all it requires then is an accounting system, and that's what this common monetary foundry is of mathematically perfected economy. It effectively, replaces a central banking system, and it certifies creditworthiness, which a central banking system doesn't really do. It's impossible for a central banking system to truly certify creditworthiness because it's obfuscation of the promissory obligation, or our money, is such that it inherently multiplies artificial indebtedness. So it doesn't matter if today your salary is S, and that means you can afford to service some debt D, because that debt D is going to increase in relation to your salary S. So as time transpires, this obfuscation of the currency destroys your creditworthiness to service the debt D, which is perpetually increased in relation to the circulation or remaining capacity to pay. So anyway, the other point we needed to come back through with that background, which pretty much covers the things that we're solving as well, is this what I call artificial indebtedness. Now, I'm using those terms without exaggeration at all. Here's the thing. These ideas were introduced by a story that I've called since 1975, well, shortly after 1975, a parable of perfect economy. And this is a story I was invited to a lecture because I was telling somebody about mathematically perfected economy, and they were complaining about taxes. And I said, in 1975 in Alaska, and I was telling them that, you're complaining about the wrong thing. Because unless you fix the economy, your taxes always have to go up because the government can only assume further debt. And they needed to know how and why. So I explained to them how this obfuscation of the currency inherently and irreversibly multiplies artificial indebtedness in proportion to the circulation, because the obfuscation of the currency comprises an implicit obligation. No, the banks don't. Why is it an implicit obligation? The banks don't tell you, you're going to have to pay principal and interest out of circulation while you service this debt. You would shrug your shoulders and say, well, what do I expect? I believe the banking is the right thing to do. Banking, what does that mean? Does it mean all this? We never thought that it did, but it does, you see, and we don't understand it unless we realize this. Well, you shrug your shoulders and think, well, I have to pay principal and interest out of circulation, so what? Yeah. Well, the banker's shaking his head thinking, what a fool, because you have to borrow that back into circulation in order to continue servicing that debt. So what's your debt now? Do the arithmetic. I have people who haven't given this 15 minutes of quality time in their whole lives. After 40 years of, the top economists in the world challenging it and being laughed out of, G. Edward Griffin has turned his position entirely since the Ron Paul campaign. Edwin Vieira, Ron Paul's, so-called foremost authority on constitutional money, has changed his opinion. He's stolen all my papers, plagiarized my work. All these people have changed. Bill Steele's Money Masters video is so much plagiarism of my work. It's pathetic, and people don't even realize it. And all the people in that video were advocates of interest. And now he comes out with this Oz thing, which is so pathetically ignorant that and now he's claiming money's got to be interest free, but he's going to do these combinations of things which increase reserves. What does that mean? It just sounds like it's going to help you out, but reserves is a stupid process which can never be honored, because and it can never serve you, because in order for reserves to serve the ostensible purpose of reserves, there has to be as much of them as there is of everything else. But to have a money with integrity, the volume of the money has to equal the sum of everything. So there's no way for it to mathematically work out. The only reason you need reserves is you haven't perfected economy. You see, so it's a misconception which can't even be upheld. It's stupid as stupid gets.
And we all need to hear this, and thank you so much for explaining all this to us, because, the average American, the only answers we ever get from Alan Greenspan or Ben Bernanke is that we don't need to know.
Well, you should listen to my last two radio programs, which undress Ben Bernanke's recent few news conferences thoroughly, sentence by sentence, and sometimes phrase by phrase. They're nothing but lies. They're nothing but evasion. I basically even proved that he knows so. Every American president, every United States president since then, including Gerald Ford, has received an exhaustive proposition on mathematically perfected economy from me. This is something that's been a long, ongoing, personal battle. The Reagan administration, when Reagan just announced that he was going to run in 1979, he advocated that he was going to decrease federal taxes 10% per year for 3 years, and this would balance the federal budget and offset. He meant to imply that he was solving price inflation, what I call price inflation, and what he called inflation, and this is what we all have to realize. It's the patterns of communication are they tell it all from the very beginning. When a candidate for president says we need change, Ronald Reagan said we needed change. You know, when they say that, you know, that doesn't mean they're the man for the job. It means already that they're probably not the man for the job.
Right.
For the job, because what the man for the job does is he shows exactly what the cause is of the problem, so that we can understand exactly what the solution is, so that we can all get behind it. We don't just say we